CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode with me, Beginko Smoyo, on Conversations on African Philanthropy. Today I'm joined by Memory Zonde-Kachambwa. You were saying you are the president of FEMNET, the CEO and the executive director. Let's start there. What do names really do to our identities?
So names it's when you use them, and names talk a lot about positional power. So a name, you have your given name, and I carry a double barrel name, recognizing the patriarchal lineage that I come from. And so names are important. I think naming ourselves is very important.
Yeah.
I also name myself as a Pan-African feminist, which in itself is an identity that I carry. And names are so important.
I read somewhere that you also, I don't know whether it's you describe yourself or others describe you as an intersectional feminist. Can we break down that identity, intersectional feminist?
So I think intersectional for me is being able to understand the lived realities and knowing that we are not homogeneous. So even when you talk about being an intersectional feminist, it's recognizing the different feminisms and how they are expressed and how they are owned by the different feminists, how they are informed by the geographical, the geopolitics, the experiences, the historical experiences, the identities that people also choose to identify themselves as. So by intersectional is, so I call myself that because I believe there are a lot of feminisms and, we are not homogeneous.
So let's talk about the work that you do at FEMNET. For those that don't know what FEMNET is and what it does, can we perhaps maybe give them, like a 101 class on what FEMNET is, what it does, and why it actually was established?
Okay, so I'll start from FEMNET, why it was established. So FEMNET is one of the largest feminist networks and women's rights organizations. We are 35 years this year in 2023. So we've been really working on ensuring that women are engaged in policy spaces. How we began, what happened was there was going to be the World Conference on Women. So it was going to happen in Nairobi. And this conference had happened in Montreal, in Canada, and in Mexico as well. So when it was coming to Africa, in Nairobi, there was a realization amongst most of the actors. Back then, there were no ministers of gender, for example. So this was being organized by ministers of foreign affairs. And there was a whole need for women to get together and say, we need to have an organization that can share information so that we are able to engage in all these processes that will be happening at a global level. So that's how FEMNET came to be. So following the Nairobi summit, which was the precursor to the popular Beijing summit that most people know, the World Conference, the fourth World Conference on Women, FEMNET was actually formed. And it actually resulted in having robust participation. So when women went to Beijing, they were able to come up with a common Africa position in terms of what are the certain tactics, what are the particular issues they want to influence in the Beijing conference. So that's how FEMNET was born. And one of the things that actually came from the Africa group was the issue around the girl child. So it was actually coined on the African continent and included in the Beijing Platform for Action and Declaration. And also when women came back from Beijing, FEMNET was there to also monitor and to support and to link in terms of how do we make sure that what has come out from this global conference can actually be implemented who is doing what sort of language. When you talk of language, you mean what sort of policy language can countries actually use in terms of ensuring that the gender machineries are established in their respective countries. So we go on to even about Maputo Protocol. I'm just fast forwarding. In terms of what is FEMNET. So this is the kind of work that we do. So we work across the continent. We have members in 50 African countries, but a presence in all the 55 African countries. We also recognize the countries which are recognized, the states which are recognized by the African Union. We also include diaspora as the 6th region on the continent. So we are working with African feminists who are in the diaspora, who have work and who want to connect. And recently, we're also working with the Pacific and the Caribbean networks as well. So essentially, our work as FEMNET is to push policy, is to ensure that we do a lot of advocacy, we do a lot of capacity strengthening. We are sort of like structured and framed around 4 main areas, which we call like anchors. So the first one is on feminist solidarity. So when you talk about feminist solidarity, what does it mean? When something happens in DRC, in Niger, in Sudan, something is happening in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, we have our members who are able to bring it so that the network can actually know, send solidarity messages, connect them also. A lot of the time we have human rights defenders who are in crisis, so we connect them to the organizations, the feminist philanthropies, which actually support women human rights defenders. Our other anchor is around soul, building an organization with a soul. So using feminist organizational effectiveness tools to be able to say, what does it mean to be an organization with a soul? How can we internally organize ourselves as a membership network? But also, how can we also transfer that and also learn from other organizations and networks, so that as a movement, we are really sensitive about building organizations with a soul that center people, that center well-being, that also are brave, that also are disruptive in the kind of work that they do. Our other anchor is also about power. So when you talk about power, we are talking about how do we dismantle the oppressive power, which we know our geopolitical positioning is. We are a continent that has been colonized. And within that, we know that our positioning has to really shift the colonial power and its impact, the neoliberal power. It also needs to look at all the issues around racism, how they also intersect and how they also interact, the class issues. So most of our programming are under that anchor around power. So within that, we are also looking at specific thematic areas that we work on. And we work on climate justice, feminist transformational leadership, where we work with women in politics and women in leadership in public, private, and civil society. Our other thematic focus is on sexual reproductive health and rights, and ending harmful practices, and on ending violence against women and girls. And then the last one, the last thematic area that we work on is on economic justice and rights. So under sexual reproductive health and rights, we also look at sexual reproductive justice. So we are moving not just from the rights, but to the justice. And our last anchor as FEMNET is on voice. So we really believe that we want to amplify the voices of African women and girls in all their diversities. So what we have is we use a lot of tools online. We really want to start shifting narratives in terms of having, if we are working with young women and girls, have to speak for themselves, to be able to give them the opportunity. So we curate, we catalyze for them to have a voice at the policy spaces that we engage in. It could be the African Union, it could be the UN Commission on the Status of Women, it could be in the different convenings. We are very intentional about ensuring that the African women voices are the ones which are actually speaking and shaping policies, and they're shaping the narratives. Under our climate justice program, we work with women who are at the center of the climate crisis, because most of the times, most of these spaces, they will attend in terms of just attending, but they are not actually given a chance and a voice to be able to speak in their language, in their own understanding, besides all this jargon.
Yeah.
And in our economic justice and rights, another way in terms of the way we organize is we also have academies, which we do, and these are spaces where we curate to ensure that the different activists are able to have a deeper understanding, because we believe we need a lot of thought leadership within the movement on all these issues. So we have an academy on climate justice, an academy on economic justice, an academy on feminist transformative leadership.
Yeah.
So that's FEMNET.
Yeah. Thank you. And obviously, in the 35-year history, there have been some ups and downs. Are you in a position to reflect on some of those, but also with the view to almost showcasing some of the successes? Because at the end of the day, a 35-year history is really a heritage, and we must be in a position to celebrate that.
Yeah. So I think for us, when we started, we were really receiving a lot of vertical funding from UNICEF. Actually, UNICEF was the UN entity that sort of like housed us. So we started by being incubated as a network. And then, of course, over the years, we're able to establish ourselves. So our physical office is in Nairobi, Kenya. Initially, we started in Tanzania, then we moved and got registered in Kenya. So over the 35 years, it hasn't been that easy, because we just started as a small secretariat. And one of the major challenges that we had was ensuring that there is representation in terms of the diversity. It could be the language issue, ensuring that all the documents are translated. So one of the things that we know is at the UN, for example, at the Commission on the Status of Women, the negotiations on the outcome document is done in English. So it's not translated. So they will send us 0 draft, and then we would then use our resources to ensure that we are able to translate it, to ensure that the Francophone, sometimes the Portuguese, and sometimes Arabic, but most cases we just have to just translate it to French. So that's one of the major challenges in terms of when we reflect, to be able to have the resources which can allow us when we talk about inclusion. And, we always say to be inclusive, it means an intentionality, but it also means a presence of the person or of the people to be the ones who are leading that work. So to ensure that even within our secretariat, with that diversity, we're Francophone, we have people coming from all the 5 regions of the continent. So that's what we've also managed to do, and also include even in our governance, having a representative of young women, a representative of the diaspora, but affirming ourselves as a feminist organizations. And we had also had a governance crisis around 2012, 2013. I mean, we had to disband. We had a trustee, we had a board of directors. So there was some, disagreements thereabouts, but we managed to then restructure and really start asserting ourselves. But we have seen a lot of growth. We have seen a lot of expansion. Also in terms of the political positioning, calling yourself feminist in some countries actually puts you in a lot of danger. So being part of a Pan-African feminist network means that we have to be also sensitive to some of those realities. What does it mean? We will still push, if it means we use language, but still allows to have those feminist values, still allows us to be able to have a penetration into the country and to support the work that is happening. So it's also being able to be agile, to be able to move around some of that, because we are all diverse, and on the continent, it's not easy to be able to ensure that we are meeting all the needs and the expectations that are expected out of us. But I should say, I think we've really pushed. We've really had a lot of support, and just recently, we have been pushing for what we are calling Africa Disrupt, where we are saying the Commission on the Status of Women has been happening 67 years now in New York. And we realized that it's so difficult for us coming from the continent to, first of all, to afford, secondly, the shrinking space. We are not able to even engage in the discussions and things like that. Yet it's a very important platform which was set up to ensure that the Beijing is implemented, that the gender transformative, the gender issues are actually included. But we find it's not a place which is really accommodating us. It's difficult for us to get visas. So we have been really pushing for them to consider and to actually move it from it being done every year in New York, but to also look at other countries which actually have the same UN structures. It could be even Geneva. It could be here on the continent. We have Addis, we have Nairobi. We also have other processes, UN processes, which are more inclusive, like the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. So we are actually have been having a campaign because we find in such a space where it's the women in rural areas, it's the young women who are denied year after year to be in that space where they should be. So we've been doing this campaign, and we are still pushing to say, yes, there are always these technicalities around. This is how things are meant to be. But we saw with COVID how COVID disrupted the way of our working. So it is an opportunity for us to start thinking differently around inclusion, and more so for women's rights, so that where it matters, and for the women who are supposed to be having their voice, their presence in that space. Because our governments, most of the times, do not even want to listen to us. So if the space is shrinking at a national level, at a regional level, so the global level can actually be the space which can ensure that, they are able to have that interaction. So that's one of the things among many.
So you mentioned earlier that there are different variations or versions of feminism. So one would want to know, how do you moderate among the different versions? So that's one. But two, you also spoke about issues of voice, power, soul, among others. How do you incorporate or work with your grassroots, feminist organizations? For example, in Kenya, I'll probably think about the grassroots women's human rights, which also has, an affiliation like Rachel's outfit, the Pussy Power. How do you work with those groups that I think, as I read some of their work, I realized how they were affected by COVID, for example. And COVID is a specific moment that managed, or rather calls for us to adopt a lot of the principles that we are articulating, whether it's issues of care, wellness, issues of an organization being the one that has a soul, etc., etc. So those two, how do you moderate, among various variations, but also how do you work closely with the grassroots versions of feminist movements?
So we are always being asked about, we see you doing a lot of work. How does that affect how does that affect my mother in the rural areas? That's the question when we're developing our strategy, our 10-year strategy. So every question we're getting was, how does that affect my mother or my sister in the rural areas, in the informal settlements? So one of the things that we are very deliberate about is actually working with the diversity. So it's bringing their lived realities, for example, so that their lived realities can be heard by the policymakers, and also ensuring that they can share their experiences into the different spaces and platforms. So, for example, we worked a lot with Zanele Mbeki's foundation, where they had, they called it the AFWID, the African Women in Development Conference, just pre-COVID. And one of the things we did was to identify 7 women's rights organizations, women human rights defenders who are in all the African countries to be able to be part of that. So that's how we work. We have members, women living with disabilities, we have gender non-conforming persons, women working on land rights issues. So in all their diversity, I think the good thing about FEMNET is that it's a diverse network. And every year at the African Union, for example, they have a specific thematic focus. So they may be focusing on, like, I think this year they were looking at the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So we are able to say within our membership who is working. They could be doing cross-border trading. They could be market women. They could be women working in large enterprises. There could be groups working on think tanks, which are working on feminist policies. So we are bringing them together for maybe pre-conferences so that they can actually influence the regional economic commissions. They can influence the AU member states conferences. So that's how we work with them. And it's so we are so, that is actually why we try and bring them to be, if we are to go in any space, we want to first reach out to the communities, which in most cases will not be able to participate, and also to link them up. So we do a lot of that networking to say maybe there's this network of women's rights organizations. So we have individuals and organizations. So which makes our network that diverse in terms of, you know, we have radical feminists, we have feminists who really front maybe liberal feminism. So it's bringing them all together. We have those that just want to focus in terms of coming up with papers, doing more research, more academic. So we are able to accommodate. And one of our most exciting work is working with girls and adolescents, girls who are like from, this year I think we had a girl who was almost 16 years, 14 years, because the thing is, when would they have a chance to be in the movement? So we also realized there was a huge gap and these are girls who, we are specific, girls from key populations, from communities in informal, rural, living with disability. So we really target them to be able to come together for the Africa Girls and Young Women's Festival, which is a space that we curate as a safe space for them to be able to link with other girls, but to really discuss what, you know, what do they want the policies, because a lot of the times we are in these spaces without giving a chance, and we do it in ways which are not the usual workshop of panels, but we're just really just having conversations, a lot of storytelling. We had the same, our Climate Justice Academy, which I mentioned before, where we actually we identify women who in most cases are not part of an organization. They might not be registered, but we know the women who from Nigeria who were part of pushing against the pipeline, the women from South Africa who were agitating against the big oil companies, the women who experienced the recent flooding in Malawi, the women who are still crying from the cyclone that happened in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, bringing them all together, the women from DRC who were displaced by the Inga Dam and these big IFI projects. So we bring them in a space where it's a healing space. We are sharing tools of feminist policy influencing, and that's how we actually reach. So there's also a huge assumption that if my grandmother, who never calls herself a feminist, but she did amazing feminist work. I mean, we are also curating some of her stories, It is the African women in
Yeah.
any country you go. You go to Ghana, you go to Tanzania. It's the African women who have never been recognized. They've been invisibilized. And yet they did amazing feminist work, even against the colonial, pre-colonial, we have them. Even now we have them who are really agitating and pushing against all these oppressive powers. And so our role and some of what we do is to really make sure that you might not call yourself a feminist because you're living in a rural area, but what you're doing is feminist work, and it should be recognized for that. And we also respect you for not saying you are not feminist. But we also want to start dismantling these notions that, oh, feminism is elitist. It is not elitist, you know. Of course, you might have the people who are in most of these platforms, most of the times, they are seen as being elitist, but it's actually not. So when we go right to the community levels, in all the communities, it's just amazing, because at the core of feminism is around power, you know, building power within to be able to overcome the oppressive power. So that's our work.
So as we draw closer to ending the conversation, what's next for FEMNET? If you cast your eyes maybe into the next 10, 15 years, what would you say are the next frontiers for the kind of work that you are doing?
So most of our work really is around, so we've seen a lot of the anti-gender movement, which is really affecting the work, you know. So we find we're in a current space where we have the shrinking civic space, which affects civil society. But more so for women's rights, for Feminist Network, is the anti-gender movement, anti-gender, you know, who are really insidious in terms of they support the governments, right? They take them on retreats. They are able to use other tactics. They are well funded. They are well organized. They have long-term plans. So us as FEMNET, what we are also doing is trying to also organize ourselves to be able to be more resilient, you know, to be able to ensure that our work is continuous, you know. So we find ourselves in most women's rights organizations are the least funded. There's a lot of data which shows that. So doing advocacy for more funding to go to women's movements, regardless of how they are, they could not be registered. Sometimes they're not registered. Sometimes they don't want to be institutionalized. It's a movement. So also ensuring that we continue with our advocacy for that. Our issues that we are working on are issues that we are working a lot on economic justice and rights, on tax justice issues, on debt, you know, canceling debts, restructuring debt, because we see how the burden is. Issues around the K economy, understanding it from an African perspective. When we talk about the work that we do on curbing illicit financial flows that are coming from the continent and having investments that will go to fund and to support feminist movements, social justice issues, you know, political issues. One of the things that we find most of the time is we want more women to participate, but we know how monetized and how violent the political space is. So part of our work is how do we start transforming that space, getting more women to be in that space first, and then transforming it within that. And of course, continuing, we see ourselves really continuing on our work, using our networks, on our work on climate justice. I think already we are part of the Africa Feminist Climate Justice and the Africa Gender and Women's Constituency, but really having a movement of African women who are able to influence policy. So we have two frontiers, for them to participate meaningfully and for them to be able to understand and break down. So for example, our Climate Justice Academy was looking at climate finance. What does climate finance mean for the rural woman, for the woman who's been displaced? How, when you talk of loss and damage, all these funds which are being talked about, adaptation fund, how do we make sure they actually reach and there are also reparations for all the damage that is made? But that women are central to shaping these discussions, because we see how they've been made very complex, very technical. So we sort of like break it down so that we can shift the narrative. So our work is really moving towards that and really pushing for more inclusion to really say, when you talk of sexual reproductive health and rights, we are coming up with the African Feminist Charter on sexual reproductive health and rights to say, when we talk about our bodily autonomy, it's not foreign. So we find most policymakers, anti-gender movements saying, that's foreign to us. When you talk about sexuality, what does that mean? Comprehensive sexuality education. Why is it important for ensuring that, women are able to make their choices on their bodies, and that it is African, and that it is needed, and that we need specific investments around that. So I think in the next 10 or so years, we really want to build a very strong movement that is also linking with our diaspora community, and also out in the global spaces as well. It's very important for Africa to be represented, to also push and input into those policies, because we know how geopolitically policies which are made at a global level are adopted, and they will then influence us. So we are doing a lot of work around that. We also, like our work on debt, is also looking at how do we shape issues around debt, these working with the international financial institutions. How do we have them look and analyze them with a feminist lens around that? And just really being the network that is disruptive, that is able to influence, that has the voice of African women and girls.
We certainly wish you another 35 years and even more. But finally, when we were in Naivasha, I think beginning of the year, and Trust Africa and Age and Action Fund were setting up this Pan-African Feminist Fund, and people were asked to contribute. You donated, I think, unborn calves, and when I met you 2 days ago, I think, or yesterday, I immediately asked you about those calves. What is the importance of philanthropy, African philanthropy, for that matter, in the work that you do? Because your donation was very unique, and I was intrigued by it, because I personally believe that we have not tapped into the powerful forms of African philanthropy empowering our movements.
So I think for me, coming from the African background that I come from, the source of wealth has always been cattle. And one of the things which, so one of the things, I come from, my father was a farmer, my mom was a farmer, and I remember there was always a cow which was meant for the mother. And that cow was given when she got married, etc., and things like that. But the other cows might not be given physically, but that one had to be physical. So I think for me, it's really saying, I think as Africans, we do have the assets in terms of really giving. And you find most women, they give of their time. There's a lot of unpaid care work, a lot of community work that women actually do in terms of social justice, which is most time, it's not even recognized as work. They're expected to go to rallies, they're expected to support this and that. So we have been giving a lot of our time. It's just not remunerated in terms of the kind of wealth as money. But I feel we have a huge wealth that we can actually give, and we have already been giving as communities. But even beyond that is how do we ensure that the way we are talking about African philanthropies is also informed by feminist and women's movements as well. So we have feminist philanthropy funders, but we also have the feminist movement. So I think one of the things that I'm always saying is also important for us to also have the movements themselves also speak within the philanthropy spaces, also interact with the philanthropies to be able to shape how they want they want the sort of funding, what it can actually do for them. Because when we go into the technical in terms of how the money, sometimes it's so complex. I mean, it requires a lot of work for, you talked about pussy power. And, you know, she was talking about how it takes a lot for them to be doing all these proposals, meeting all these demands. So I think having more and more movements to be part of the conversations on philanthropy and also showcasing what they will do to them. So, for example, we were actually discussing with my colleagues from Kenya how one of the organizations, they gave a women's movement. It was a group that was working in one of the informal settings. So when they got the money, they divided it amongst themselves. It wasn't, so they were like, how do you move from that? They didn't use it for program, but they've been doing so much work. I'm always talking about this young lady we work with from Kibera in Kenya. And during COVID, they built a shelter. They built a shelter by themselves using sand, using recycled materials, and they built a shelter. And when one of the funders wanted to fund them, they were like, oh, we need to give them money, but they have no structures, you see. And all they wanted is their effort was never compensated. So when they get money, they'll divide it. You know, you go, you start your biashara, your business, you go do this, you go do this. So it's also how I think there needs to be a lot of transformation on the people who are receiving, but also what we term as philanthropy. And I think Becky are always talking about how we are givers on the African continent. But I think it's how do we make sure that it really works for us. And, you know, when a lot of talk around trust-based giving, multi-year, you know, predictable funding. And for me, this is what I think the message is, if we have more of that, and we've actually seen funds. I mean, I'm always, you know, impressed by the Black Feminist Fund. Even though we might, you know, the way Mackenzie gave him money. I mean, for me, that's how. I mean, giving organizations money for their mandate. We will do our work, which is unfunded. When you did Africa Disrupt, it wasn't funded for, you know. When we started the Academy, Economic Justice, it was something that we sort of like curated, and then, you know, we managed to get funding. So I think having more of that to say, what do you really want? What does your mandate, you know, say? What is your strategy? And then getting funding for that. And also learning how to diversify and sustain that.
Certainly, we could have more conversations. I think we're going to end it here, and hopefully in a year or two, we might catch up with you just to check how we are doing. So thank you so much, Memory, for joining us. It has been my pleasure just listening to the great work that FEMNET is doing.
Thank you so much, Becky. I had a question.
Yes.
No, my question was just in the data and the work that you're doing. I'm just very curious also maybe to find out whether you've been looking at women's organizations, movement, how philanthropy flows around that from an African perspective. So I'll be just happy if you can also share some of that work as well.
So we do have a couple of papers, but I don't think the data has been that consolidated enough to give us a sense of what's going on. However, we have an initiative that we have already established, Women in African Philanthropy. And that initiative has got several dimensions. One is research. So under the research dimension, we're going to be doing a lot of research that is focused on women and philanthropy, looking at the flows of money, looking at the work that they are doing, etc., etc. The second dimension will be around teaching. Again, you know, when you look at our modules are not specifically on women and philanthropy. They might have some elements of that, but we want to develop curriculum that is specific to women and philanthropy, and that we would want to do in collaboration with organizations like yourselves, the Black Feminist Fund, and many others, so that you curate the curriculum yourselves around that. We have done that with other institutions, for example, on advancement and resource mobilization within Yatelo, because they are the specialists there, so we have designed that with them. And then the third dimension is going to be around advocacy. Advocacy on certain issues, policies, enabling environment, and that is going to be informed obviously by research and the practice, what will be happening on the ground. So I think it's a realization that we made just a couple of years back, that our programs are not designed well enough to be engendered, and we want to engender them.
Okay. Yeah, and also I think just one thing which I also found is a lot of the times we talk about data and research and policy, yet we find our Africa way is a lot of storytelling. Harnessing those stories and making sure that they are authentic enough to inform policy. They are also authentic enough to be able to shift things and creating more space for them. But of course, we have to write.
Behind you is Kisima African Giving Platform. It's a platform where we have actually invited different people from across the continent, organizations, to send us stories. Those stories could be in writing, they could be videos, they could be WhatsApp notes, etc., etc. And we have collected stories from, I think, more than maybe 6 or so countries right now. And those stories are in any language of your choice. The site automatically translates the languages into whatever language you want, as long as the module is on site. So I think we have about 13 languages right now. So again, in terms of collaborating with different groups, it's really to invite them to send stories to the site. What we are seeing now is that those stories are now being used by our lecturers, by our students, whenever they are starting, let's say, community philanthropy, African ways of giving. Then they go to those stories because they are captured in such a way that they are telling exactly what people are doing on the ground. So again, it's a very good question, because it forces me to then invite you and your networks and others to be part of the Kisima Giving .org.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you so much. That was Memory Zonde-Kachambwa talking to us from the sidelines of the 4th African Conference here in Sali, Senegal. Thank you for watching. See you next time.